Well, welcome everybody. We have a very special guest. It's Vassilis Galanos, and he's currently, as you can see from his interesting background, in Edinburgh, in Scotland. He's not doing the John Muir or Rob Roy trail, because we were talking before off the camera. We were talking about many things like extreme distance walking, but also about couch surfing. And I can guarantee you he's a quite interesting guy, not only from his huge CV, but also from his interests, academic, like non-academic, like sports, like cultures. So very interesting guy from Greece, from the beautiful city of Thessaloniki. It's the second largest city in Greece. It's the town I always remember from Lefkos Pyrgos. And they have actually very interesting film festival also where I once worked in 2009. So, well, Vassilis, welcome. How are you doing just right now?
Good. Thank you very much for having me, Alejandro. I'm in this very weird situation where I need to rush and write my PhD down. I have imminent deadlines, and I just submitted a paper to a journal. But that being said, it's Friday, and I'm excited to meet with a friend and listen to some vinyls tonight.
It's interesting how we met, because we are sending un grande saludo a Nathan Horowitz. He's a writer, translator, and teacher in the US. He lived also in Austria, in Mexico, in different countries. And he wrote a very interesting book where we both participated with some stuff. And Nathan, if you see us, un saludo. And Vassilis is writing a PhD on the social dimensions of artificial intelligence and robotics at the University in Edinburgh. And maybe because you mentioned it already, you can do us or give us maybe an elevator pitch about your thesis. What is it about?
So let's imagine we meet at the elevator and I have 1 minute to share my PhD. So many people talk about artificial intelligence and robotics today, especially artificial intelligence and big data and things like that. And I try to investigate how expectations are shaping our views about artificial intelligence, how images from the future shape contemporary research, and who counts as an expert to speak about this stuff, because everyone today speaks about artificial intelligence, but very few people have coded a single line of programming. So I interview artificial intelligence experts or people who work with it. That's pretty much it. And I reflect on how artificial intelligence is perceived in the mind of the public, as opposed to the mind of the person who is shedding tears and sweat over a computer to make a robot do this small movement.
Very, very interesting, and very well done in 1 minute. How do you bring this topic? If you already mentioned it to me, but also from your CV, you have a huge, like, multi-perspective view, we could say, because your other academic interests include also, as I can see, cybernetics, media theory, information science. You even mentioned it also on Facebook, the continental and oriental philosophies, even religions. And so sex boots, the ethics of digital sampling. Then you have a music channel. Comics are part of your interests. How do you bring, you seem to me like, I can very identify myself with you, no? And even because you are from Greece, so you seem to be like a polymath from the 21st century, or is it possible? Or how do you bring that all together?
Well, I think polymaths are a bit different. Polymaths, the way we perceive them at least, where people who had simultaneous training in many things, and polymaths in the past where it was easier to be a polymath in the past because the knowledge was more condensed, and you could spend some time painting, you could spend some time learning mathematics and so on. Now I think it's just a continuity of curiosity. That's what I'm very much interested in. It's actually a subject, a field that interests me academically as well. The difference between curiosity and doing things because of deadlines or doing things for bureaucratic reasons. So I've always been curious, and the more I explore things, the more I see continuity, but also connections between things. So, for example, when I was a kid, I read many American comics, Marvel comics, for example, and there was a reference there about parallel universes, and how you can have the Marvel universe as we know it, but then you can have an alternative universe where, for example, Spider-Man is a woman, Spider-Woman, and so on. Then I realized that this is based on actual physics, that there are people who have written about these things in the 40s and in the 30s. So it's not science fiction. Then from comics, I went into books, and from books, I started making connections. I got my first degree in librarianship because I wanted to learn how people tend to classify things, but also how classifications don't work. So, for example, if you have a book called History of Philosophy, do you put it, when you go into the library, do you put it in the history section or the philosophy section? And what if there are new forms of knowledge? So, for example, gender studies haven't been a thing 50 years ago. Well, they have been a thing, but nobody had an explicit label at the library. And all these classifications showed to me that things are very, very subjective. And for example, when it comes to religion and artificial intelligence, I would say that artificial intelligence fascinates humans way before the invention of the term. So if you look at ancient mythology, Adam is in fact a robot made by God. Or if you look at religiosity and mysticism in particular, you can see the myth of the golem, the idea that you can create something out of the human form that looks like a human. Hephaestus in ancient Greece had made robots. In Kalevala, in Finnish mythology, there is an equivalent of Hephaestus who makes a golden goddess. And then, for example, I used to play video games. So Tekken was one of my favorite video games. And you could see that, for example, there is a robot called Yoshimitsu, but also a wooden doll called Mokujin. And both of them, they were inanimate objects, but they both had souls. They were animate. And this, then I found out that if you look at Japanese literature about robotics, academic literature, you will see that Japanese culture is open to animism. So their amazing contemporary advances in robotics, some would argue that it's based on their long-term appreciation of the inanimate as animate. So it all connects, and the more curious you are, the more you can see the connections. I don't know if this answers your question.
Well, as I already compared you with the Polymata, you're close to Stageira, where Aristoteles was born. And I think Aristoteles also was embarking a lot of disciplines, not only academically, but he also tried to label the stuff, classify, especially in botanics and these issues, but even in ethics, no, Nicomachean ethics, etc., politics. Zoom Politikon, etc. And you just, because you mentioned your bachelor in library studies, that's very interesting, because now you're like more in science, innovation, technology. And you definitely have to come to visit me, because I'm currently facing the issue in my personal library that is like 16, 70,000 books. How to classify them, no? Should I go by the name? Should I go by, like you mentioned, no, it's so difficult. And at the same time, I would like to have an order. How can you bring order, not only in this sense, order and chaos, no? There have been many scientists or writers like Mircea Eliade who has thought about this, no? So it's a quite interesting issue. And also, you mentioned this labeling. How could we label you? Because you have different backgrounds, so many interests that I found interesting. So I think you would have been 10 years ago like the nerd in school, or how can we see you?
I was a very bad student, especially in high school, because the way things were taught didn't motivate me at all. I'd rather listen to rap music, and I'd rather read
Rap?
comics or yeah. I've been listening to rap music since I was very young. And this relates. You mentioned Mircea Eliade, who has also written about shamanism. And believe it or not, rap music led me into my interest in shamanism. But this is another story. But I would say that yes, how to label me. I hate labels. I'm very much interested in labels. I'd be very much interested in how people would label me. Because that way I could understand a lot about the society and where they live in. I will tell you a little story about Dewey, who was a very famous librarian and who made the Dewey Decimal System that many libraries use. So the first label he made was about books about library science, and many people think that he did that because he thought that his science is the best. But in fact, if you went to his home, his personal library, you would see that he wanted to have the books that are most interesting for his studies. He wanted to have them nearby, so the reach of the hand, I can reach the book that I want. In the farthest points of his personal library, he had the books he had the least interest in. So literature, for example, or geography, he had no particular interest in these fields, but he had some books, obviously, because he was a polymath. So it was very personal. And I faced the same problem as you, but what I did for my library was that in the center of the library, I've put the books that I'm mostly interested in. And then towards the corners, I've put books that I don't read often, or that I, for some reason or other, they ended up with me. So it's a practical sense. And you face all sorts of problems in classification when it comes to alphabetical order or thematical order. But it's very interesting to study these things. Even, for example, you said that my disciplines are quite different right now, the library science and the science, technology, and innovation studies. But in fact, whatever a fact is, if there is a fact, our questions are very similar, because science, technology, and innovation studies is about how knowledge is negotiated. So, for example, artificial intelligence, what is it? Is it a technology? Is it a science? Is it a practical application? Some say it's philosophy, some say it's psychology, some say it's cognitive science.
It's against this labeling, like in the library, no? Is it history? Is it philosophy?
Yes.
It's a compromise
Exactly.
that we make, no?
Exactly. So
Okay.
that's why I'm interested in expectations and expertise, which is about who decides what labels we put onto things. And very often, expertise is a matter of power. Because if I am a powerful librarian, or if I'm Google, and I say, why do Spanish people, and let Google give me some recommendations, I see what is the most powerful, and then I'm sort of inclined to click on something that other people have done, or who knows, an algorithm trainer, a data curator decided to reject some of the recommendations and increase visibility of others, because this is a job as well, data curation. Anyway, this is I resist labeling. That's the short answer to your question.
It was, of course, a little bit a provocant question. I agree with you, but it just seems interesting to me that you have many interests, like myself, I would say. That's why we are talking here. And I think, and maybe it would be another question, curiosity, because you mentioned it. How was it in your personal, professional development and decision making? You finished the high school in Greece. You mentioned you were not such a good student. Of course, I understand the pedagogics. I didn't like school. I hated school, and still in the end, I studied so much. And I don't mean only academically, but you are a curious guy, no? How would you see it? What was the trigger cause for your decisions you took, studying what you did, your career so far, and at the same time, with these rational minds, because we have these stereotypes like who studies technology, science, innovation, classifying, etc. It's like a very rational mind. It's science. It's not like history, like philosophy. It's blah blah blah. How would you see from your innovation studies the point of shamanism? Because you also mentioned it, that you are very interested in this, and normally also maybe the superficial view that we have about shamanism is that it's totally contrary to rationality, no?
Yeah, I think since you mentioned Aristotle, I think all problems begin with Aristotle. I hate that guy. So
I thought so.
So Aristotle basically made all these divisions between rationality, good and bad,
Dualism.
ethics, and so on. All these dualisms, and then René Descartes sort of stabilized this thing with a rational mind and so on. You mentioned chaos and order. We learned from physics that chaos and order are basically two sides of the same thing. So if I make a skyscraper in the middle of the desert, that's some sort of order, right? I impose order into the chaotic desert. But then if I make a second one next to it, it will still be order. If I make Manhattan, this will be chaos. We reach what we call negative entropy, or a sort of negative order that resembles chaos, and then it's equated to chaos. Similarly, chance and necessity, we learned from biology that they are two faces of the same thing. So if you ask me, I would say that my decisions into pursuing the particular PhD and the particular masters have been rational decisions I've made. I sent particular papers, my intention was there, but the chance of it, the reason I'm in Edinburgh in particular, or the reason I went to Denmark for doing my master's, were very, very random moments of decision. I could elaborate on those, but some of them are quite personal. I would say then, when it comes to shamanism, I have colleagues who actually study the legitimacy of Western medicine as opposed to non-Western, non-traditional, or non-traditional in Western studies, traditional in their contexts medicine. For example, I have a colleague who works in the field of studies the field of Chinese traditional medicine, and he told me that, well, in certain places in China, you can go to the Western doctor, but then the doctor will not prevent you from going to the traditional medicine doctor as well, because some communities accept both versions of science. I wouldn't say that anything isn't science, but you can have effective or ineffective science, and there are multiple factors that sort of determine the effect of science. And with shamanism in particular, I have spent some time in Tuva, which is this region right above Mongolia, within Siberia, within the Russian Federation. And one particular thing about Tuva is that it's the only place on Earth which the vast majority of the population believe in shamanism. I think it's a very high number. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's something like 70% of the people are shamanic inclined. The problem I saw there was that many shamans are impacted by what I call the sort of new age understanding of shamanism. So I've met a shaman who does all the feathers and all the big things, but he has a very expensive car and a driver, and he asks something like 2,000 euros for a ritual, for a one-day ritual, right? But I've also met a very, I would call, underground shaman with no feathers, nothing at all, partly alcoholic, who just met me. He saw me. He saw that there's something obviously different about me. I mean, my skin color and my external characteristics showed that I'm not local. But he saw something in me, and we started having these discussions, mediated through a younger girl who was cured by this shaman and who spoke some English, and we could communicate. And he performed the ritual for me for free. And we met again a couple of times, and I verified through other people that he was a well-known actual shaman and not the commercial kind of shaman. So in this respect, I think that it's a matter of social context, always. I would say that the same person in contemporary Greece could be considered what we call in Greece the madman of the village. But in other contexts, this sort of appreciation of irrationality is considered to be mediation to forces that are invisible to the world. And there's always a certain unknowability about things we know. If there are extra dimensions, additional dimensions, we have no clue about it. There's a very simple evidence. If you have Abbott, an author from the 19th century, I think, spoke about the fable of Flatland. Imagine a dimension. Imagine a world, a universe where height does not exist as a dimension, and then there is a sphere moving in. How would the inhabitants of this flatland perceive the sphere? Many witnesses would gather. The best they could do would be to describe it as a dot, which progressively expands into a circle and then becomes a dot again and disappears. But nobody would have the idea of a sphere. So what if extra dimensions go through our universes, and what if shamanism and other irrational, non-Euclidean, non-Aristotelian approaches have some merit?
Yeah, quite interesting, and I think it goes along with what we said about being out of the norm, not labeling anti-Aristotelic, so we could form the League of Anti-Aristotelic Aristotelians, Concerning the travels, that because I know you have traveled a lot, you just mentioned you traveled to Tuva in Siberia, and you also before mentioned a little bit about how several personal decisions took you to study in Denmark, now in Edinburgh, your BA in Thessaloniki. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on that, and also regarding, like, I would be very curious, like you are very curious, to know what drives you, why you do the things you do, why you travel to this place, where, of course, it's not the most touristic place that you spend after 2 years lockdown or 1 year lockdown in COVID, that you go to Antalya, that you go to Bibione in Italy, or to Peloponnese. Why you go to Siberia, why the interest in shamanism, why you study what you study, why you are such a curious person that is not living the life working from 8 to 5, going home, consume, blah, 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 blah. No? Why you have this intensity?
Why I don't have an answer to this. I have specific answers about the rest of the questions, and maybe if I bring all these together, maybe we can have some sort of idea about the why. So as I said, I've been listening to rap music many years. One of my favorite bands is called the Asian Dub Foundation, which they bring a mix of drum and bass, rap music, and Asian elements such as Indian and Pakistani elements. And they had a collaboration with some musicians from Siberia, and their vocals resembled rap a lot. They were like, and I listened to that and I was like, this is like rap music, but it's not rap music. And then I started investigating about what this band's name was and so on. I found out about Tuva. I found out that a famous scientist called Richard Feynman and Nobel laureate actually wanted to go to Tuva, and when he actually managed to get his tickets kind of prepared to go there, eventually he died right before he goes to Tuva. So there was a big legend about this place and about Westerners going to Tuva. That was around 2007. I started investigating about Tuva. At the same time, I was investigating stuff that had to do about the relationship between the society and information technologies, because that was my bachelor thesis topic. And then I encountered the works of a Czech author who migrated to Brazil during the Second World War, called Willem Flusser. And he spoke about, I would call this digital nomadism, the idea that through new technologies, you are able to become a nomad, that you sit on your terminal. He was way ahead of his time. He wrote about these things in the 80s. But right now, for example, I am visiting you. You're hosting me at your dad's place without me physically moving. So right now we have this sort of nomadic understanding of the world. Later on, I found out that another philosopher from France called Gilles Deleuze also spoke about nomadism, and he used nomadism as a metaphor about science and about scientists who refuse the state version of science and who are curious and who want to proceed with their curiosity, and usually they never get funding, by the way. So these two things I learned together while I was interested in a country that makes this beautiful music that resembles a bit rap, but it's not only that. And at the same time, this country has an inclination towards shamanism. And all these things brought together, I developed a huge interest in Tuvan culture. although my interest, I would say, is quite what we would call postmodern, because I think the average student doesn't really think about digital nomadism or rap music in particular as related to Tuva music, and so on. Although I have found some rappers in Tuva. And then the lesson I got from living in Thessaloniki for many years and being inclined G's, such as situationism, is that you always need to respect the locals, you know, the way real people live in. So I don't care about writing about my perceptions of Tuva and rap music and digital nomadism. I care about meeting with real people from Tuva. This is what we call in social sciences ethnography. You know, spend time with the people. I learned about ethnography here in Edinburgh in 2016, but I think I did that through couch surfing many years ago. I just didn't keep any notes, unfortunately, and I didn't know how to code all of my experiences. So if I had a second chance, I'd repeat all these trips and then say, well, I can make a PhD out of it because I have material. But now it's a bit late, and now I'm just doing artificial intelligence and robotics.
Just that we get a little impression about Airbnb, because the only notes probably you have are probably the positive reviews you got. How many places did you travel with Airbnb? Or how
you
many?
mean couch surfing?
Yeah, sorry, in couchsurfing, of course. In how many places did you stay at couchsurfing? Like,
yeah, it's interesting that you're asking that, because I've been the only ones I have counted were the ones that I hosted, and these are over 300. But I think I have been to at least 60 or 70.
quite impressive. So in different
People.
countries, no, there's experiences.
Yes, I mean, it depends what you mean by country. So because I'm very critical about what we consider to be a country. But for example, you know, Turkey or Russia are massive. So I stayed in many places around Turkey or the Russian republics. And all these, in my mind, count as very different places, regions. But it's a pity, you know, because my passport says Russia, one country. And at the same time, you know, I don't believe that there is great difference between Greece, Macedonia, Bulgaria. I treat all these places like a single unified region. And I've traveled across the Balkans. I've done places in Europe. Unfortunately, I have Airbnb'd in the States. I went to New Orleans last year, but I would say that it really depends with Airbnb, because the person who hosted me in New Orleans, she could easily be a couch surfer. She had this sort of spirit, but the deal was that, you know, I give some money. So I realized when couch surfing, that's I guess an interesting message to relay. When I did couch surfing, when I was hosted by people, I always bought them presents. I would find a book I really like in their local language, and I would give it as a present. I would always go to the supermarket or the shop and you know, fill in their fridge with things before leaving. I would contribute to the chores of the house and everything. So sometimes I thought, you know, many people use couch surfing to save money, but I always end up spending more money than if I went to a hostel. And I guess that now this sort of gifting attitude is being replaced by the automation of Airbnb, that you just pay in advance, and then you turn that into a less spontaneous, more automated thing. But I've met many Airbnb people, for example, in where was it, in Poland, that I went 2 years ago, who were actually ex-couch surfers, and they faced those financial difficulties I mentioned before, and they just switched to Airbnb. But hanging out with them was basically like hanging out with couch surfers. So yeah.
Nice, nice.
Again, this labeling thing. What is couch surfing? What is Airbnb? Yeah.
Well, the last two questions I would like to ask you, and of course, I hope we will have you soon again here on board. And if you like to add something else, of course, this is a space. Lafcadio Hearn, because actually this is one, for me, it's a very interesting character. And I think this is also one of the many things we have in common, because I read that you did something on Lafcadio Hearn. And books, you mentioned already some books that you were giving as a present, etc. Maybe you want to tell us maybe about your most impacting books, or the books, your favorite books, or the books that you would recommend us. And these two questions, and if you like to add something else.
Yeah, so Lafcadio Hearn is a figure that I have identified with in a very uncanny way. I learned about him in 2014, and just by looking his biography, I found many things that I could relate with, or that were surprisingly similar with my personal life. What many people don't see right now is that I have an eye deficiency, have a rare rare condition called amblyopia, and Lafcadio Hearn didn't see, had injured his eye when he was young. But this is just one of the smallest details that I said, well, even that, it's incredible. And people like Lafcadio Hearn, who never had a home, who were not digital, but actual nomads in the I would say industrial times, because Hearn was conceived and born in Greece, but he was soon sent to Ireland. He spent some time in London, in France, I think. Then he moved to Cincinnati, USA, then to New Orleans, and then to Japan, where he wrote most of his books, and he got mostly famous for. So people like Lafcadio Hearn, but also Willem Flusser, are sort of these kind of nomads that inspired me to accept nomadism as a constant. If there is one ancient Greek philosopher I particularly like, this is Heraclitus, who said that the only thing constant is change. And you could tell the difference between the pre-Socratic philosophers and the Socratic or Aristotelian philosophers, who perceived stability as the standard and change as the constant, as the peripheral or sort of non-standard way of looking at things. So about books I recommend, that's a tough one, because the more you read, the more difficult it is to have like 5 or 10 books. My favorite ones, although I know that they might be a bit demanding, I would start with James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. So when James Joyce published his most famous book called Ulysses, the critics said, this is the most difficult book written in English language. And James Joyce also had an eye deficiency, who was also in Ireland, he said, well, you considered that the most difficult book? Well, I will write another one. And he wrote Finnegan's Wake.
And you know that some of the parts of this work he wrote in Austria?
Yes, indeed. And I think he ran a cinema in Austria. Yeah.
He was on the way before or after he was in Switzerland. He was in Vorarlberg.
Exactly. Yeah. So what James Joyce did in that book, which is a cyclical, circular book, it starts, the first sentence is a half cut sentence, is the last part of a sentence. The first part of the sentence is the last sentence of the book. So you can read it eternally and make circles. And it's basically taking an old Irish ballad as a story, which is called Finnegan's Wake. He removes the apostrophe between the Finnegan apostrophe S, and he turns the wake of Finnegan, who died, into an order. He asks the readers who are the Finnegans family, to wake, to stay awake and mourn about the dead. And it's through the book you can read about the entire human history, the history of technology. You can read about the history of Ireland, and you can read all of his amazing new words, because Joyce created new words in this book. And I really enjoyed this kind of thinking that is all encompassing and apparently chaotic, but with large order underneath, or extremely orderly with large chaos underneath. Another book I would recommend by Willem Flusser is Into the Universe of Technical Images, which tells a lot about the way minds are making certain gestures. So, for example, what is it to abstract? What is to make things more concrete? So he takes the different changes sort of attributed to technologies, and he takes this as a point of departure to speak about how humans think with technologies. Another book, quite dense, is called The Thousand Plateaus by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, which was also a revelation to me, because it offers a new way of thinking. Until then, the metaphors we used were very geometrical, I would say. We thought in terms of lines, in terms of circles, in terms of squares. If you read any philosophy, any history, it's either about the cyclical history or the linear history and these kind of things. But Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari said, well, we will use geology instead of geometry. So they started using metaphors from geological sciences, from geosciences, and they started speaking about nomads and territorialization, or the idea of deterritorialization, of turbulences and geological turmoils. You know, how does a volcano erupt? Well, perhaps this brings a better metaphor about how a human mind might erupt at some point. These three books, I think, have influenced me the most. And I also appreciate the writings by Zen poets or Zen monks, because they, I'm very appreciative of the idea of a koan. So koans were little riddles that the Zen masters posed to their students, and usually these are unsolvable riddles that contain a contradiction. So we are now on Zoom, and you see the impact of the background that doesn't show me in complete. And I tell you, do you see that stick that I'm holding? If you say you see that stick, I will hit you with it. If you say you don't see that stick, I will hit you with it. Normally the student would, in order to pass the exam, let's say, she or he would have to pick up the stick, imaginary or not, and hit the master with that stick in order to solve the riddle. Now we're on Zoom, and I don't know what the reaction would be, but maybe this is the answer as well.
Well, this reminds me actually on, I don't know if you know Alejandro Jodorowsky.
Absolutely.
He also reminds me a little bit on him. And Zen Buddhism, really, I also appreciate. Daisetsu Suzuki, for example, also is also one very famous author on this. I don't know if you have heard about it. Also, like to give away a recommendation. Well, Vassilis, Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. It was really great to have you here. And I think the audience and me, we could listen to you many hours, how you combine the different topics, your rationality, your creativity, your curiosity, music, rap, how you combine it with shamanism, the books you mentioned. So really, really very interesting and inspiring. And yes, you're always welcome. And we will surely have you back again if it's possible. I don't know where your next stop will be as a nomad, if you will stay in the highlands with Loch Ness, or if you will come down to Europe or to another place, or if we see us in the Amazonas. So I'm sure you're quite a traveler.
I'm sure that we will meet each other again, either digitally or in person. I might be visiting Munich very soon. And this
You're
is
quite close.
Exactly. So let's hope for the best. And thank you very, very much for having me. And I'll be very glad to catch up soon.
Perfect. Bye-bye, Vassilis. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye, Alejandro. Cheers.